MOSAIC, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
At least 4 people were killed and dozens were injured by a car bomb near a public restaurant in northern Baghdad. 7 civilians were killed and 13 others were injured, including a Kurdish official, in a suicide operation and a mortar attack in the city of Kirkuk and the surrounding area. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda Jihad in the country of the 2 rivers claimed responsibility for assassinating General Wa'il al-Ruba'i, an official in the Iraqi Ministry of National Security.
Another bloody day in Iraq. This has become the main feature in Iraq after the new government was formed. Dozens of people were killed and injured as a result of a car bomb that targeted one of the restaurants in the suburb of Talbiya, east of Baghdad. The explosion detonated in the afternoon when dozens of customers were eating lunch at the restaurant. Nearby stores and dozens of civilian cars were also damaged.
About 53 to 57 people were severely injured. As for the martyrs, we cannot even count them, because when we looked inside the cars, we saw a lot of unconscious people.
Not far from the Iraqi capital in the Mansour neighborhood, unknown armed assailants driving a white car assassinated Wa'il al-Ruba'i, a security advisor for the Prime Minister and his driver, on their way to work. The assailants escaped to an unknown destination. This operation comes within a series of assassinations that target senior Iraqi officials almost daily. In the city of Samarra in northern Baghdad, 2 Iraqi soldiers were killed by a mortar attack on the army and police station. An American source reported that 2 car bombs exploded, one near the U.S. Army base and the other while passing by a U.S. Army patrol in the same city. In the city of Tuzkarmat, 70 kilometers south of Kirkuk, at least 7 civilians were killed and dozens of others were injured, including a Kurdish city official, when a suicide truck bomb went off in front of the administration office in the city.
The explosion took place near the administration building in Tuzkarmat. As a result, 5 civilians have been martyred and 19 others are injured at this point.
Meanwhile, 2 Kurds were killed and 3 others were wounded, almost all from the same family, when a mortar shell hit their camp in the Sharjah neighborhood in northeast Kirkuk. The family had returned to the city to stay for good. They had expected to be living in peace after they were expelled from the city during the era of the former regime. The Shatay refugee camp in Gaza is a place of suffering for Palestinian refugees, both on the humane and political levels. Thousands of families live at the camp, sharing their lives and sharing a dream to return to the homes they were forced to leave. They are fighting to keep the memory alive, so that their dream is not impacted by the hardship of living in exile. If the right of return is subject to compromise, then the refugees will continue to hold on to this right and will not accept any alternatives. This is the Shatay refugee camp in Gaza. It is as if time has stopped. In these narrow streets, life has fallen into a boring and depressing routine, leaving the people bitter. In every corner of this camp, there are detailed stories of the misery of the people at this camp. People from Jaffa, Haifa, Ashkelon, and other places came to this camp and never left. To be a refugee means that you have to overcome the challenges of time and loss of memory. The favorite thing for the elderly here is to challenge their memories and recall some of the stories from the past. The refugees talk about the pain and the hope. And generation after generation tells the story of their family as if it's an inheritance that must be maintained.
This is the key to our house. Our house in the country, we will never let it go, no matter what happens. We have the right to return. The legislation and the entire world gave us the right to return to our city. We don't want anything else.
Here, no dream is stronger than their dream to return. During their time alone, the refugees reflect on memories of their gardens and the olive and citrus trees they left behind more than half a century ago. Therefore, the right of return is a dream that they are not willing to exchange, and is a right that is not subject to negotiation or compromise. What is happening behind the scenes in the arrangements to eliminate this right in peace agreements, or to come up with mediocre solutions, is opposed and denounced by the refugees.
If God is willing, we will return to our city as long as we have this key.
At the edge of this refugee camp, you can see the Gaza coast. The sea breeze revives the hopes of the refugees, but reality kills their hopes. Despite poverty, the refugees are dealing with their fate with pride and honor. They know that their cause is an asset for politicians who trade with it on the international arena. They are fed up with the empty promises and vows of solidarity.
We are asking the Arab countries to negotiate on our behalf. As for the Jews, we'll settle the issue with them. Either we get rid of them or they get rid of us.
It's the fate of the Palestinians to live in a reality that rejects them. Year after year, their country seems to be farther away, either physically or due to time. Nothing is left of it except memories and rusted keys.
At the time when the world is talking about the importance of peace in the region, the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced from the United States of America, Israel's primary sponsor of the peace process, that Israel will not return to the June 4th, 1967 borders. In a speech in front of representatives of American Jewish organizations at the Baruch University in Manhattan, Sharon stressed that Palestinian refugees will not be allowed to return.
After arriving to Washington, Sharon did not waste time in defining the conditions for the peace process to the American public. Hours after arriving, the Israeli Prime Minister renewed his rejection to withdrawing to the June 4, 1967 borders. He talked of protecting the large settlements in the West Bank, and he rejected the idea of allowing Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. According to Sharon, his unilateral withdrawal plan from Gaza on August 16th is an Israeli compromise. His rejections came in order to confirm his intentions to continue settlement activity in the West Bank and changing Jerusalem with further settlements as a preparation to consolidate the city, impose a reality on the ground, and escape from international obligations regarding implementing UN Security Council resolutions and the return of Palestinian refugees. In response, Palestinians hurried to reject these statements.
We consider the refugee problem one of the final status issues. It must be placed on the negotiation table according to the roadmap. It must be debated according to international law and resolutions, and especially Resolution 194.
The president of the Palestinian Authority also requested the Americans implement the roadmap.
We will request that Bush offer an honest American position regarding the implementation of the roadmap after the end of the Gaza withdrawal.
Abbas's statements come at a time when he's preparing to meet U.S. President George Bush at the White House next Thursday. Although Palestinian officials don't have high hopes that this visit will place pressure on Israel to enter into final status negotiations after it withdraws from occupied Gaza, Palestinian officials confirmed that President Abbas is trying to obtain guarantees from President George Bush to hold Israel responsible for implementing the roadmap after the withdrawal from Gaza to reach a settlement on occupied Palestinian territories and the creation of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state.
Ordinary Palestinians confirm the importance of holding the parliamentary elections on June 17th as scheduled. However, they differ on how the elections should be held. Some want elections by district, while others want a popular vote. Controversy over the upcoming preliminary elections are still ongoing between the presidential office and the parliament. However, ordinary Palestinians are determined that the elections should be held at their scheduled time, the 17th of July. Palestinian citizens are very interested in the outcome of this controversy, and they all seem to agree that the elections should be held on time. Some believe that if the elections are postponed, the situation will be escalated, and that only a few parliament members will benefit.
We hope that the elections will be held on time, but some parliament members are creating obstacles in order to serve their position and interest. We hope that Abu Mazen will insist that the election be held on time on July 17th. If the elections are postponed, then everyone will be suspicious, not just me. It is better if the elections are held on time.
Palestinians are clearly divided on whether to conduct the elections by district or by populace. Those who support a popular vote believe that it is the best solution to overcome tribalism and divisions. This group forms the majority. The other group believes that conducting the elections by district will enable citizens to elect the person they want, which is not possible to do through a popular vote. Citizens are asked to elect a party, and these parties are the ones who will decide on the person that they want to represent them in the parliament.
In general, if you want to know what the people want, then election by populace is the way to go. I think that elections by district are better than elections by populace, God willing.
Disregarding the controversy on whether to have elections by district or by populace, ordinary Palestinians believe that the elections must be held on the 17th of July. Some parliament members will not say publicly that they hope the parliamentary elections will be postponed because they feel that the Palestinian voters will not elect them again. Faris Sarfandi, Al Alam TV, occupied Ramallah.
Former Prime Minister Omar Karami withdrew from the electoral race for parliamentary elections scheduled to begin on May 29th. He will boycott the polls to protest what he described as an electoral law that is corrupt on all levels. But his closest ally, also a pro-Syrian figure in North Lebanon, MP Sleiman Franji, confirmed, according to An-Nahar Daily, he remains a candidate. This afternoon, President Emil Lahoud warned that the country is undergoing a dangerous political phase and urged solidarity, criticizing the current electoral law, which was actually passed when he presided over cabinet. Lahoud said the electoral law creates an imbalance between the Lebanese parliament, including loyalists, which had rejected the letter that Lahoud sent them saying the law must be amended. They accused him of attempting to derail the polls. Lahoud today said Karami's decision to bow out of the race was another negative consequence of the electoral law. Anti-Syrian opposition protests forced Karami to submit the resignation of his government 2 weeks after the assassination of his predecessor Rafik Hariri last February, which many Lebanese blamed on Syria.
Karami's attempt to form a new government failed last month, and he was blamed by the opposition of trying to postpone the elections scheduled to start on May 29th. In a move that reflected unease over his popular base, Karami told local new TV station he will boycott the polls and will not run or vote, but he made clear he will not quit politics. Karami, who is a member of parliament since 1991, blasted the elections, which he said were being held on the orders of the US and France. He said the new parliament would be charged with carrying out the, quote, dirty job of implementing UN Resolution 1559, co-sponsored by Washington and Paris, calling for the withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon and disarming Hezbollah. Syria ended its military presence last month, but there has not yet been any move to disarm Hezbollah. Karami said he was also protesting what he sees as the appointment rather than the election of the legislature's new 128 members. Pro-Syrian politicians are facing an uphill battle against powerful anti-Syrian factions that have recently joined together to try to end the pro-Syrian sway over the legislature. Karami admitted his allies were facing a severe challenge against an emboldened opposition. They have already managed to grab half the seats in Beirut due to a lack of opponents. Elections are to be held on 4 consecutive Sundays. They will be monitored by international observers. Karami's move followed similar decision by former Deputy Premier and former legislator Isam Faris, another pro-Syrian figure who pulled out of the election race. Late on Friday, the Islamist movement Jama'ah Islamiyah said it would boycott the polls, owing to, quote, unjust electoral law and excessive international interference. The complex electoral law guarantees parliamentary parity between the country's Christians and Muslims, even though the Christians are in a minority. Jama'ah Islamiyah said holding the ballots on the basis of the prevailing law was criticized by most political forces. It is a meaningful electoral force in some main cities. Christian figures, including hardline leader Michel Aoun and Lebanon's Maronite bishops, have said the law would disrupt the country's fragile coexistence. But the Maronite Church toned down its criticism after opposition figures confirmed they would draft a new law when Parliament convenes after the election and after constitutional deadlines to amend the law had passed. They warned against attempts by pro-Syrian allies to derail the polls and create a power vacuum. The international community has been pressing Lebanon to hold elections on schedule, even under the current law. Meanwhile, a delegation representing Progressive Socialist Party chief MP Walid Jumblat held talks with Setrida Samir Shaja. Discussions with the Lebanese forces were an apparent bid to forge an electoral alliance in Mount Lebanon's Ba'abda district. In the event, talks between Jumblat and General Aoun collapse. Aoun has been demanding 4 MPs in that district. Another major force in Ba'abda is Hezbollah, which said it is awaiting the outcome of coalition talks to decide on which alliance it will join. While the rest of the opposition made headway in forming alliances, Aoun has gone his separate way.
And in Jordan, State Department officials said Syria must pull out its intelligence agents from Lebanon and accused Iran of funneling millions of dollars per month to Hezbollah. They said the outcome of legislative elections in Lebanon will likely apply pressure on Hezbollah on whether to, quote, remain an armed militia or become a political party.
At the World Economic Forum regional meeting along Jordan's Dead Sea, Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick said Syria's pullout of military forces is not enough. It must also withdraw intelligence agents out of Lebanon. Under huge world and Lebanese pressure, following the February killing of former Prime Minister Rafik al-Hariri, Syria last month pulled its troops from Lebanon, which it entered in the early days of the 1975 to 1990 civil war. But Scott Carpenter, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, said Syria was still meddling in Lebanon. He said Washington remains deeply concerned about the level of interference and continued manipulation on the part of the security and intelligence services within Lebanon. He vowed U.S. and international pressure to make those connections also withdrawn or suspended. Prime Minister Najib Mikati had said Damascus did not have any influence over Lebanon's political life since it pulled out, but Carpenter told a panel discussion on Lebanon Washington was monitoring Syrian troop movements. He reiterated calls for Hezbollah to disarm, as stipulated under UN Security Council Resolution 1559. Branded a terrorist organization by Washington, the group has broad support among Lebanon's large Shiite community for helping end Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon in 2000. It has several elected members of parliament. Carpenter said the international community through 1559 was very clear. Hezbollah must disarm. Carpenter, who said the forthcoming legislative elections will help Lebanon become a normal country, also had harsh words for Iran, accusing the Islamic Republic of funneling millions of dollars per month into Hezbollah. He said the U.S. will continue to put a good deal of pressure on both Syria and Iran to stop funding the group. In Beirut, Hezbollah's Deputy Secretary General Sheikh Naim Qassem said the group's arms was an internal matter and not an international issue. The group vowed not to disarm until Israeli threats and breaches of Lebanese sovereignty end. Hezbollah has said it was ready to discuss options proposed by the Lebanese over its armament. Some opposition factions want immediate talks over Hezbollah's arms following legislative elections, amid reports that Israel could withdraw from the occupied Shabaf arms soon.
Education ministers of some Arab states and their counterparts and representatives from G8 member states discussed education reforms in the Arab world. The meeting, attended also by United Nations representatives, came a day after the World Economic Forum concluded its three-day meeting at the Dead Sea shores, in which education reforms figured high on the discussions. Nida Ramahi has the details.
Representatives from 34 countries and United Nations organizations met at the shores of the Dead Sea to agree on a declaration that would help cut the rate of illiteracy in the Arab world by 20 million over a 10-year period. It is the first ministerial meeting on education to take place in the region and brings together representatives and ministers of G8 countries, broader MENA countries, and UN organizations.
We need a recognition that education can be transformational for a country. I give great credit to His Majesty in Jordan for recognising the reforming power of education and for focusing on a wide reform in order to help to ensure that Jordan is the successful, prosperous, safe country that it deserves to be. And my argument was that actually we need to recognise that individual piecemeal initiatives are not sufficient to get the sort of reform into an education system that are going to deliver the results for individuals, but also for the economy and the society that we want to see as well.
The discussions centered around the communique agreed on yesterday at a pre-ministerial gathering that sets guidelines for educational reform under 4 broad themes: educational reform, literacy teaching, equality and social integration, and quality education. The one-day gathering was set up like a think tank, where industrial and developing nations, along with representatives of UN organizations, met to streamline their goals for educational reform, addressing the political and financial angles.
Arab countries and Islamic countries have committed themselves to really moving forward on the reform of education and tackling major chronic problems that face our educational systems in the Arab world. And I saw from the international community, namely the G8, the international organizations such as UNESCO, the OECD and EU, their commitment through the Barcelona Declaration and other multilateral and bilateral projects that they are going to focus on helping transferring best practices, also providing for the knowledge and know-how in order to really work together and move forward on issues related to education.
Education has been a key issue in almost every declaration and agreement set, due to the belief that without it, equality, political stability, and economic prosperity cannot be fully achieved. All the ministers attending today gave their approval on a 4-point action plan, an educational action plan, with a meeting set to take place in Egypt next year. This is Nida Ramahi reporting for Jordan Television.
U.S. President George W. Bush told Afghan President Hamid Karzai that the U.S. military would cooperate and consult with the Afghan government in operations to root out remnants of al-Qaeda. At a joint news conference with Karzai in Washington, Bush said the U.S. military would, over time, send Afghan detainees at Guantanamo Bay back to their home country. Bush was giving a reaction to remarks Karzai had made on when the Afghan president had expressed shock at a U.S. Army report on abuse of detainees in Afghanistan. Karzai had demanded his government wanted custody of all Afghan prisoners and control over U.S. military operations. Karzai said Afghans were upset over reports of prisoner abuse by U.S. troops, but do not blame the American people as a whole. Likewise, Karzai said American people were not to blame for the report released by Newsweek magazine accusing interrogators at Guantanamo Bay of desecrating the Quran, an accusation that was later retracted.
In terms of more say over our military, first, in terms of more say over our military, our relationship is one of cooperate and consult. Of course, our troops will respond to U.S. commanders, but our U.S. commanders and our diplomatic mission there is in a consultative relationship with the government.
Of course, we are, as Muslims, very much unhappy with Newsweek bringing a matter so serious in the gossip column. It's really something that one shouldn't do, that responsible journalism shouldn't do at all.
U.S. First Lady Laura Bush met with her Egyptian counterpart Suzanne Mubarak in Cairo, the third and final leg of her Middle East tour. After their meeting, the two First Ladies took part in the famous television show Sesame Street and called on a school for girls. Mrs. Bush is also expected to meet with Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. The U.S. First Lady arrived in Cairo from Palestine, where she was received by protests from both Jews and Muslims. Her visit to the Middle East, which also included Jordan, forms part of President George W. Bush's push for democracy in the region and for restarting the stalled roadmap peace process between Palestinians and Israelis. Europe's main democracy and rights watchdog expressed concern about increasing Dutch intolerance towards Muslims. Omar Orhoun, ambassador on combating discrimination against Muslims for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, said the unfortunate dimension of identifying Islam with terrorism emerged after the 9/11 attacks. He stressed on the need to address this wrong perception and the discrimination and intolerance that has come together with it. Home to almost 1 million Muslims, the Netherlands' reputation for tolerance and social harmony was shattered by the murder last November of filmmaker Theo van Gogh by a Dutch Moroccan for his criticism of Islam. Orhoun recommended that Islam should not be politicized by countries that are home to Muslim migrants or by the immigrants themselves, who must also do more to distance themselves from radicalism. Britain's revered public broadcaster, the BBC, suffered its most serious strike in over a decade as journalists and technicians walked out to protest plans to cut 20% of its workforce. The 24-hour strike forced the BBC to cancel or curtail most of its live radio and TV news programming, including the BBC World Service. The National Union of Journalists, along with the Becto and Amicus unions, which organized the strike, said they would call off the strike if the BBC granted a 90-day moratorium to the planned staff cuts. Their demands also included the corporation guarantee that any redundancies be voluntary and protect conditions of jobs said to be outsourced. The BBC said it regretted the strike action and would do everything it could to produce the best possible service. Today's strike was the first in a series of protests the three unions voted to authorize.
The views expressed on Mosaic are not those of Link TV or its sponsors, but of the broadcasters themselves. Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.